Hi, Wes. Welcome to Soul in the Game podcast. And welcome, guests. Thank you for joining.
Yeah,
On
thanks for
this
having
show,
me.
yeah, thank you. I'm so excited. On this show, we will talk to people who don't just have an interest in the future or in topics that are important, they also have a personal stake. And today's guest we have is literally the definition of that. Wes was born on Earth Day, but his path to sustainability wasn't just a typical corporate office. He's a former senior intelligence officer who was trained by the US government to navigate the high stakes uncertainty of battlefields in a place like Baghdad. Today, he is applying the same intelligence first mindset to a different kind of global crisis. That is, we can call it the climate transition or the environmental problems, any name we can give. We are all facing it. We know that. Wes is also the co-founder and writer at Sustainability Decoded. It's the newsletter for sustainability professionals. Wes is currently the director of energy and sustainability solutions at Prologis. And he has previously worked as a global lead for supplier decarbonization at Amazon and also other big corporations such as BCG. Wes sits right in the gap between high-level boardroom promises and the messy reality of power grids,
Good way to put it.
contracts, and supply chains.
Yeah.
He holds a PhD in sustainability from Arizona State University and spends his days structuring massive energy transition strategies for the big corporations in US, dealing with heavy lifting of AI data centers, EV charging, and Scope 3 emissions. He's here to talk about why the environmental challenges demands execution, not just ambition, and also share his side where he comes from as a senior intelligence officer mindset into the sustainability world. So please welcome to the show, Wes Herche.
You got
Welcome.
it? Yeah. Thanks. That's an awesome introduction. I'll try to live up to that.
Yeah, you have a lot of background that I wanted to
Sure.
untangle and then put it out. Like it's a good
Yeah.
context, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thankful to be here.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, so let's tell me about, I already told a lot about your background. Tell me something I didn't cover. Like that's not part of your LinkedIn profile, probably.
Yeah. I've been to and lived in a lot of places in the world. That's probably a good place to start. So I think I stopped counting. I have to go back and count. I think I've been to 40 or 50 different countries maybe, and then have lived in six different countries, including the US. And then we lived in Japan twice, so maybe seven if you count that twice. Yeah, so quite a bit of international travel and sort of living as an expatriate in other countries, and a bit of a global mindset in terms of how I think about the work that I do and just sort of people and societies. Yeah, that's probably some of that is sort of on my LinkedIn in terms of places that have been working in other countries, but maybe not quite as clearly. And then the travel, I think it's a great way to sort of understand people and societies and decisions and frameworks when you're able to see those from a lot of different perspectives. So yeah, it's a big one for me.
That makes sense. I think for sustainability, we need all those perspectives because of the wicked challenges it brings up. And we can't just think, oh, I'm in US and everything is like US around the world, which is
For sure.
completely
Yeah.
not true. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And 50 countries, that's amazing.
I think,
Visiting.
yeah, traveled quite a bit. Ironically, too, this is definitely not my LinkedIn. That always wasn't preordained, I guess. We grew up pretty poor by American standards, to your point. I have a distinct memory of, I think it was like the fourth or fifth grade. So it was a bit of a backstory. So the grade school I went to in this little town that I grew up in Indiana, it literally had kids that were from two sides of a river. It was on sort of one end of the town. And on one side of the river was the nicest part of the entire town. It's where all the doctors and lawyers lived, and where their kids went to school. And the school was actually in there, but I think there wasn't enough kids for that school. So then they ended up taking the first 5 streets on the other side of this river.
Oh,
And I
wow.
was on Fifth Street. Literally, I was the Fifth Street. It was called Fifth Street. So I was right at the edge. And then literally the kids the next block over went to Robinson, which is a different school. I went to Forest Hills. And then I remember, like, because this makes sense if you think about, like, a lot of these kids were so more from more affluent families. There was a big sort of international thing they did every year where all the students in Forest Hills going, I think it was we started in the third grade, and then you did the trip on the fourth grade. You started learning French. Everybody, there's no choice. Everybody started learning French because there was always this big exchange where those kids with their parents went and flew to Paris for like a week or something. It was a big deal, right? Um, we definitely could not afford that. Like, so we were, but it was weird because I decided to go through the program and learn French and whatever. I mean, not really, but like you learned a few words and whatnot, and it was fun. And I remember thinking at that time, maybe one day I'll get to meet someone from another country. Not that I
Mm,
would get to travel somewhere, or not that I was just like, maybe I'll be able to meet someone from another country and like, wouldn't that be amazing? Like, oh my gosh, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to talk to someone that didn't grow up where I did. So when I think about the perspective of that versus having lived all over the world and traveled and stuff, I think, yeah, I'm pretty fortunate.
that's such a beautiful story. I can relate to that. Living in India, South India, I wanted to meet people outside my state or spoken
Right?
because India,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And then now you're also living in another country, right? So
yeah,
wow.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's nice to have go back when we are confused or question or where we are. Like I think go back to that desire, like or that question we had as a kid or as we like curiosity more than anything. I think the curiosity we had is a good driver.
Definitely. So from India to Indiana. So yes, we share
Yeah,
that across.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Wes. That's,
Yeah.
I think many people can connect to that type of, childhood story. We all have something we go back to.
For sure.
Yeah, moving back to your, intelligence life, officer life. In intelligence, you often have to make life and death decisions with incomplete data. You don't have a lot of data. How has that shaped that specific battlefield type of mindset helped you or shaped you to navigate all this political theater that we have to do in the sustainability world of corporate net zero commitments or the targets that we have and with very little data and often messy data as well?
Yeah. Uh, I'm trying to find the way to say this without it sort of coming off the wrong way, but in some ways it makes it easier. And the kind of work I do now, just in terms of sort of what the stakes are. So existentially, the stakes are probably greater, right? In terms of promoting a planet that can support human existence. That's really important. Day to day, though, to your point, what you do, let me back up. So as an intelligence officer, there's really two forms of support that national intel provides for any country, right? In my case, it was the United States. You have sort of national strategic intelligence. I've worked on both of these missions depending on different phases of my career. So that's big, like in the U.S., that's big things like, is there going to be nuclear war? And, who's doing what sort of in that regard? And how should we be thinking about that and trying to prevent, et cetera. And then when there's a conflict, in my case, when I was still working for the agency, there was the war in Iraq. And even more generally, then there's direct like battlefield support, right? Intelligence for battlefield support. They at the time they were calling it intelligence preparation of the battle space, saying like, hey, if you know something about the theater that you're operating in, and where I worked was what's called geospatial intelligence, so that's mapping and satellite imagery. So saying, hey, if we understand the terrain, that will help sort of operations for the U.S. and allied forces. When you're doing, and when I deployed to Iraq, that's obviously what I was doing there, right? When you're doing that type of intelligence work, to your point, you never have complete or perfect information. The mission requires always for more, right? So no matter what information you provide, like they're always going to want more information because they are also, primarily making those life decisions or life or death decisions. And then you realize that like the mission's rolling out regardless, whether you do your job or not. And all you're trying to do is do the best possible job you can to give sort of the best chance or the most awareness or whatever it is to the people who are executing on that. And that train's leaving, right? Like whether you perfectly prepared for it or not, if you made a mistake, like you're going to have to live with that. If there was information that you didn't have that you found out later or whatever, again, you're going to have to live with that. Those consequences are pretty high and they're pretty immediate, right? So then when you fast forward to like any other role, not necessarily just analytical roles, but like roles where sort of you have data driven decision making that's going on and whatnot, you get more comfortable with the fact that you're going to do the best sort of assessment that you can with the data that you have, and then you're going to execute because that's going to be better than the alternative. Because the alternative is if you're paralyzed and you say, well, I just don't know. We can't make a call yet. We can't like sort of whatever. They'll be like, okay, well, thanks for nothing. We're leaving now. Right. And you're like, oh, that's always 10 times worse. That's the absolute worst. So you're like, you have to make decisions and do the best you can. On the other end, this is probably a bit more morbid, but so I did that when I was in Iraq. When I was in Japan, a primary threat. I was at U.S. Forces Japan at Yokota Air Base, which is an air base split between the Japanese and the United States. So I was on the U.S. side, obviously, but worked with Japan Air Self Defense Force because it's headquartered there, and then the Japan Defense Forces more generally. One of the primary sort of strategic threats is North Korea and a nuclear capable North Korea. And this is just Wes's opinion. This is not sort of doctrine. My opinion was that the Yokota Air Base would be top on the target list of potential targets for any kind of nuclear attack from North Korea. And the reason being is because you have the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force there, and then you also have U.S. Forces Japan there and sort of headquartered there, right? So that's a prime military target, I guess, to say the least. But my family lived there with me, right? Like they lived on the military base with me. And you would go to work every day, like very focused on like, do we see anything happening? Like, are we, we're constantly monitoring, watching, and assessing whether that is today the day type of thing. Not maybe to that extent, but like what are the precursors that you would see? We used to talk about like what are the bubbles you see before the pot starts boiling, right? You're always looking for those indicators and tippers. But it's also sort of existential, right? Because you're staring at the abyss literally every day as your day job. So between those two things, I think like it's preparing you for a role in sustainability where the existential threat long term is very high, right? But I think it's what keeps me from being overcome by dread. I see this a lot in our industry where people they just get overwhelmed because one, they have too much information and they also feel like that the things
Helpless.
that they're doing, they can't draw like what's the actual impact here, right? Or sort of am I making a difference type questions, or is it just too big and it's too overwhelming and we just can't possibly overcome like these challenges? So I guess I've had like the whole first half of my career in training on that, and to say like, look, this is our job, right? Like we have to stare at this void and we have to stare at these like worst case scenarios, but at the same time, going back to that combat mission, like and yet you have to produce. You have to like still, to use the metaphor, moving the ball forward or whatever it is, like contribute your piece to that because those decisions are going to be made with or without your support. And you very much want them to be made with your support and with your view and with your analysis and with your programs and your different things that you're contributing. And so, yeah, I had a huge influence on how I approach this space.
That is very deep, and also I think it's hard to learn. I feel if I want to
Yeah.
train myself,
I don't know if
I
that's the
mean, how
best.
do I train
Yeah,
myself?
everybody should emulate that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a skill you have kind of you have it. It's your unique skill set that you bring to the table with yourself. I can't read about it and learn, or I can't. It's just
Yeah,
you've
that's
experienced it.
true. I hope sometimes, and a lot of times, the reason I'm kind of outspoken on this topic, right, is I'm hoping to some extent that maybe I could be inspiring to that degree, right? In that, like, this was a joke. Like when I was at Amazon as well, they would say like, "Well, Wes, it's easy for you. You're just such an optimist," because I'm always like smiling and I'm always saying like, "Hey, we can do these things." I'm very sort of optimistic in that way. And a lot of times when people didn't know my background, I'd explain that to them. And I said, look, I'm not an optimist because I'm dumb or naive or whatever. I'm like, it's just because like I've stared, I think, at the worst of the worst, right? I mean, being in war is not glamorous. Being in like potential nuclear threats, not fun. Like none of these things are fun things. Like they're not feel good
Yeah.
activities, right? And then say like you can come, and I don't think I'm crazy, so I'm like you can come away from that and still have like a positive approach and know that what you're doing, and not just me, like everyone that's working in this space, right? Like, which is more important, is having a positive impact and is driving in the right direction and is making a difference, even despite immense odds. And so I'm hoping that like I can be inspiring in that regard because, I to your point, like yeah, I've been through some stuff, so yeah, even if you haven't done that, that's okay. Like I think like everybody's to your other point too about had their own battles as well, right? That are equally sort of challenging for them.
Yeah.
And I think we all come away stronger from that.
That's absolutely right. Actually, I was gonna hit on that point. And you're born on Earth Day. I think it kind
Yeah,
of
I was born for it.
you
There you go.
own that as
Yeah, yeah.
as a pride, and then also I don't know if it kind of okay. I need to carry this forward, right? So
I think so. Like I was always inspired by the outdoors and whatnot. We did a lot of camping when I was a kid. I remember my 13th birthday, like I planted a tree at my grandparents' house. But then I think the way it morphed for me is I started thinking about the Earth literally, like the planet, not so much just nature and that type of thing, which led me to a degree in geography, which led me to work for a geospatial intel agency, and then which led me back around. And then there's a through line there on sort of how that related to energy and sort of what the key points are there. But yeah, I feel like yeah, I've leaned into that a lot more lately, right? Because I've seen it like I didn't adopt the leaning into that and actually have it in my headline now on my LinkedIn, even after I'd worked in sustainability for, I don't know, like 10 years before I made that switch. Because I was thinking a lot about like, hey, yeah, I do see sort of the tie points of connection. It's kind of cool, right? So I'm like, all right, cool. It was fun to have a birthday that shares with that holiday or the day of, yeah, that particular day. So, yeah, I feel like hopefully I'm born for this.
definitely, Wes, and advanced happy birthday and
Oh,
Earth Day. So
thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
while we are there. And I want to transition to a little bit of the supply chain now because you have that background as well. And we hear, I work on impact reporting side of sustainability. Um, and we hear a lot about targets or ambition in there, and that of course that's put in report because that's what the boardroom discussion is. And there is a big problem there is that the scope 3, where most of the companies really literally struggle to either capture or to normalize or to connect to the accuracy of the data. Having built programs for these billion-dollar suppliers, what is the one, let's say, uncomfortable truth about the supply chain
Yeah.
decarbonization that the boardroom executives, they don't want to hear yet? They just, they want to stay with the ambition as we talk about positivity, right? But this is
Yeah. Yeah.
again a reality.
Yeah, I don't know if this is an uncomfortable truth, but it's certainly an underappreciated truth, I think, is we talk about emissions and supply chain emissions and scopes and et cetera. And when we talk about, like, if you look at sort of GHG emissions by sector, like, I always get perturbed by this. It's kind of a misnomer in that I want to be clear, it's all energy. Not only are all emissions energy, like the entire global economy is all energy. I know that's kind of a strong position, and I know we talk a lot about energy is essential or central or whatever. I'm like, no, no, no. The entire global economy is just an expression of energy consumption, to put it more fundamentally. So, and I'll back that up. So, for me personally, this came back to like my first intel assignment was actually at U.S. Transportation Command, which is the logistics infrastructure for the all five, well, not all six service branches of the United States and the COCOMs. Stuff I worked on there, we were still thinking about how important like fuel burn was in terms of like how logistics routes, et cetera. But if you look at like we split stuff up into sectors. We say, oh, buildings or transportation or what are some of the other sectors I think when I think about the GHG emissions. But a building, like the building you're in, the building I am, there's nothing like there's no emissions coming from that building. What's where the emissions are is if you want to heat or cool that building, and that's from energy. And if that energy input is from fossil fuels, whether you're directly burning natural gas or methane in your house to heat it, or you're cooling it with electricity, and that electricity is created by coal or gas or even oil in some countries in some cases, then it'll have emissions associated with it, but it's always the energy. With transportation, like whether you have an EV or internal combustion engine, the car itself, while it's sitting parked, is not emitting anything, right? It's when you power that car, when you burn petrol, when you use electrons that maybe were generated, hopefully by clean energy, but may not be. It's always the energy, right? So when you look at like, oh, well, we have all these emissions that are associated with the product and service that's delivered. You can sort of again try to break that up into sector or break that up into like your biggest suppliers or whatever, and you can talk about like how you're going to work together and have partnerships, etc. But until you start looking at the first principles of it and say, look, ultimately, like this is going to come from what energy inputs are they putting into this product or service before they give it to me, and then how can we help them convert that energy input into one that does not have the same emissions trail, right? That's it. So in some ways, it's almost a simpler sort of equation, right? The other thing is that this is probably not more of an uncomfortable truth, but an opportunity, right? There's a narrative that's happening. It's happened for a long time, and it's sort of frustrating to see that it's still happening around, especially what's going on now with the Strait of Hormuz crisis and other things where they say, well, you know, we could go in a more sustainable way with energy, but that's going to be a cost premium. That is not true. Like, that's just fundamentally not true. And I think it's problematic that we're still talking about it in terms of like, oh, well, there's trade-offs. And so, yeah, you can have it clean, but that's going to cost you. And then, you know, or you can have it in some other way and that's going to be more affordable, but maybe security sits somewhere in between, right? There is no cheaper source of energy than free energy that comes from the sun, right? From a fuel perspective. Now, like it's more complicated than that because you have capex costs and you have ongoing maintenance, et cetera. But again, like you want to go to where those energy sources are the cheapest. And when you see emissions in your supply chain, I always say a way to think about this is that is an opportunity for efficiency improvement, right? We don't think of it that way. We think of it in this like moral framing. Like, well, you know, there's all these emissions that come with it and those are bad. So we got to stop doing those. And maybe if times are good, like we'll pay a little bit of a premium for that. But you should start seeing that and say, okay, if the cheapest form of energy fundamentally is the one that rains down on all parts of the earth 24/7, 365 days a year, been consistent for 4 billion years. Also, if you think about just again, stepping back 3 billion years ago, an organism evolved on the planet that figured out a trick on how to turn a photon into a chemical bond. And then that type of life has dominated all of the entire planet for 3 billion years. It's plant life, right? Just from that one simple trick, has figured out like it's been the most dominant form of life because it's so abundant and so free. So, right? Like, so then you look and say, okay, and you can capture that in different ways. Like wind is a form of solar energy because the earth gets heated unevenly and then the relief of the pressure differential is wind. Solar captures it directly. Even fossil fuels are energy, solar energy that's been stored for 300 million years that, you know, came from plankton that figured out that trick on how to convert that into chemical bonds. But when you see those emissions and you say, okay, well, you're now taking a more complicated route in order to deliver a good or service, to extract it, to manufacture it, to ship it, et cetera, you'll be able to tell that by those emissions. That emissions are a clue for you as to where you could get more efficiency in your supply chain or where you could encourage your suppliers to gain more efficiency in their supply chain. So I think, like, I don't know if those are uncomfortable truths, but they're certainly overlooked. And the framing is often, I think, misaligned in terms of, again, it's seen as mostly, largely, even if it's not stated overtly, like it's I think, a covert moral framing around like, well, these are bad things that we got to get rid of, right? And that's fine. I get why that framing exists. But I think like if you start to flip that and say, hey, this is a paper trail in my supply chain that's telling me like where I could ultimately drive for more efficiencies and cost reductions. Now that may change, that may take like some reconfiguration of the systems that deliver that. And that takes time, especially in global economies. But I see that as like an opportunity space versus like something like a rather than like tidying up your house or getting rid of rubbish or something like that.
Yeah, I think thank you for the, that you kept coming back to that not uncomfortable, but undervalued, I think
Yes,
is
yeah,
the
yeah.
word. So I work in the financial industry, and sustainability in financial industry is, I mean, it's financed. All the energy supply, energy is financed. But the capture, the financial emissions, I would call it, I label it as that. I think it's about, I don't know, 92% is the emissions that we don't capture in financial industry, because that's how much money is going into this funding for these technologies for of energy usage, energy production, right? The coming back to your point to where I think why we don't have, I think I completely agree with you. And on top of that, I feel like we had technological barriers, which is way better now. We have way, way better technologically. We are at a very advanced stage, and we keep advancing, right? This is not the state. We keep advancing. Logistics, I think transportation used to be a big deal. Now that has also become better. I'm going back to why probably we became so dependent on the oil versus this.
Oh,
I could,
I think I know why. We can talk about that. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, we all we all know why.
yeah,
And then storage too. I think now storage was one of the biggest barriers that people used to throw in. Oh, solar
yeah, yeah.
energy, we
Duck
can't
curves
store
and
it.
whatnot. Yeah,
Yeah. And then efficiency in usage, right? The efficiency of solar energy usage versus gas. I mean, they all play in this narratives, I feel. But again, those we cannot have those conversations as we are going back to your question, or the conversation that we were having before.
can I
Now,
say one thing about that? Sorry, I
yeah,
know you're going
please
to ask a
go ahead.
question about this.
No, no, go
I
ahead. Go
think this
ahead.
is
Go
an
ahead.
important point to step on. That is, I think, a frustration for a lot of people who are in this sort of sustainability space, right? About like, why do we have this system that's so locked in on these sort of processes that we feel like there's better tech for now, right? Or a different way to serve a lot of that demand. One thing I think is helpful to step back and look at is if you look at the however you want to measure human progress, let's say it's GDP per capita. And I mean going back hundreds of thousands of years, right? It's a flat line, essentially flat for hundreds of thousands of years. And then about 200-ish years ago, it went nearly straight vertical and still is going up and up and up, right? We've never lived in a more abundant time, either in total aggregate global GDP or in GDP per capita. And people say, well, money isn't everything. I get that. But like you can pick any other measure you want. You can pick lifespan, health outcomes, literacy rates, just any sort of measure of human flourishing that you can come up with. They all hit that same curve. They all hit it at the same time. If you look at the energy consumption in something like joules or some base unit that transfers across different energy input paradigms, right? There is a direct correlation. It's the exact same, flat forever and then straight up. That was the discovery of industrial scale fossil fuels, right? That is the world that we live in now. And the reason being is because I forget what the actual conversion is. The amount of kilowatt hours or joules that is captured in a barrel of oil is, if you look at like every other animal that's on the planet in terms of the calories they consume, I think humans need, what is it, like roughly 2,000-ish calories, right? Versus like, then we go about and live our life and whatnot. Our caloric consumption, when you factor in all of the oil we're consuming, like indirectly, obviously we're not eating oil, but indirectly in all the services and the products and goods and whatnot that we have, we're tens, hundreds, we're orders and orders of magnitude more than like our actual food consumption, caloric consumption. There's no other animal on Earth that has ever done that. We're the only one. And so you look and say, like, well, how much total sort of calories like am I consuming in everyday life that I live? We're off the charts, and that's because like we found all these stored energies. Again, those, to be clear, those all are solar energies as well, but they were stored and condensed, and now they're portable. And you see this explosion in before that our primary way to do things was to burn wood, right? And that was even after hominids discovered fire and were able to control fire, but still it was flat forever. And then we found these dense fossil fuels. Now we look and they say, well, in addition to those, which those we've named them in an article before, petrotech. So those fossil fuel technologies and all the tech that's around that still exist, still have huge value and attributes in terms of what they do. I think was it Charlie Munger put it best when he said it's just like the blacktop soil of Iowa. He was like, it's super valuable. It's like the petroleum reserves in the United States are also super valuable, or any country you have, right? Because you need them to make plastics and everything, Vaseline and
Yeah,
lipstick and clothes, and yeah, there's so many uses, right? And they are involved in fertilizer and agriculture and petrochemicals, right?
that's a big
So you
one.
think about like how much value is stored in there. That's ultimately can be used for human good. But now you say, okay, but for a lot of the primary energy services that we want to consume, whether it's like to heat our homes, to cool our homes, to transport things, or to have propulsion ourselves or other things, to have light, to have computation, I know we'll probably talk about later, right? There are multiple different ways we can solve that problem. And to your point, the technologies that we could use that don't have the same negative externalities in terms of emissions are now, they weren't cheap before. They are now, like, and they've been getting cheaper every year. And now I think solar's 90% cheaper than it was 20 years ago. Battery storage is like 98% cheaper than it was. Wind is cheaper. All these things are cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So you're like, great. So now you can start to convert like a lot of those energy services to other energy inputs that would be more cheaper for one, but also have sort of less negative externalities. But then the process is you have to reorient your entire economy at that point. So why is it taking so long? Well, because you have so much global scale industrial lock-in.
Yep.
Not because of anyone was sort of intentionally, like I don't think there was some master plan that of an evil genius 200 years ago that was like, I'm going to lock everyone into this energy paradigm, right? It just happened because they were like, wow, like this knee of the
Yeah.
curve like flew off like to space, well, literally to space actually, in the 50s and 60s. So then now you're like, okay, great. Now we have more options. It's a little more complicated to your point, and you have different ways you can start to configure this, and you can take a design approach to this and a jobs to be done approach. So I think like this, so we now find ourselves once again in unprecedented times where we're like, okay, we still have, as far as we know, quite a bit of fossil fuels that are sitting there in the reserves in the ground, right? And now this abundance of all these other technologies as well. And we still want to keep that, that trajectory, or at least sustain where we are now in terms of human thriving. I certainly don't want anyone else in the world getting poorer or more destitute or more impoverished, right? So then we were like, okay, great. How do we do that? But that's a little more complicated of a problem, but I don't think it's an impossible problem. It's just a matter of like you're taking more of a design approach, you're taking more of a systems thinking approach, and also moving as quickly as you can without sort of damaging things along the way. And you got to think about like how are you also at the same time bringing up the people who probably didn't get to enjoy as much of that bend in the curve, because that was not universal, to be clear. It's not everyone in the world is living a life of prosperity, right? And so you think about, okay, we have another inflection point in the energy paradigm. How do we also make sure that the people that didn't get to enjoy as much of the spoils of that sort of abundance get to during this new system that we're trying to build? So I think that's also important. But again, it just means that the problem you're solving is a little bit more complex, but I don't think it's beyond what humans are capable of. So sorry, I said a lot about that point, but I think it's really important to start on, because then when you start asking questions about emissions and sort of other things, like it starts to make more sense in that context, at least in my mind.
I think no, there is a lot that you said, and it makes sense. I can completely relate to everything, and I was gonna bring up that like infrastructures that are not locked in. For example, in India, when I go back, I feel they are faster to adapt to the renewable energy system versus systems who are locked in. And it's almost like, I think we did a project in ASU first year. It was a church project. When they are trying to break the system and go out of the system, they actually have a penalty for that if you're locked in. That was one of another person's, our cohort members' PhD topic, I think. So I think these things kind of pull you back in, like, okay, I would rather wait for a few years, but these other countries have an advantage because they're not locked in. And I think as we bring in the financial point of view versus a moral point of view, there's more cheaper, there's more return on investment, and that those always a win versus moral is like it depletes. It's like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to feel bad anymore. Screw that. I'm gonna go all in fossil
Yeah,
fuels.
yeah.
So I think there is a lot of good points you brought in. I just wanted to add to that that what I observe when I travel
Can
back
I
to.
add one more thing to your point?
Yeah,
And it
sure,
comes
sure.
from your home country, actually. I'm assuming you're familiar with the word jugad.
Of course, we
Okay,
we
so
own it.
I want to show you something in my background. So this is the Nataraj for those that you know, but
Yes,
for others that don't
yes.
know, I got that the first time I went to India. I'll show you something that sits under this. This was a note. I don't know if your audience can see it from my friend Nishant Kumar, who I worked with at Amazon.
Okay.
Shout out to Nishant. Oh, it just says Jugad.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
write that. Nishant did. I keep it under here as a reminder, though.
That's
We were
fantastic.
we were working on something actually in India. So my last role at Amazon, when I was leading supplier decarbonization, that was worldwide for Global Procurement Organization, and we were working on some of the APAC countries, but I was in physically in India, in Bengaluru, and then Delhi. And we were working on something, and Nishant was like, "Hey," he's like, "I got to tell you," he was like, "This is the Indian way of doing stuff, or a way, right?" And he was like, "You have to look for those opportunities every place you can find them." And I think, like, for those that don't know, if I'm doing it correctly, but tell me, I think it loosely translates to being like scrappy, I think, and we would say in the US, and resourceful and sort of in
Improvisation also.
improvisation,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
using
translate that.
ingenuity and sort
Yes.
of not waiting to your point earlier in the conversation about for the perfect plan, right? And say, like, I don't know, the perfect plan may come, but right now this is what I have, and I'm going to put together some kind of solution, and it won't be perfect, and it might be a little bit clanky, but I'm going to try to make it work.
Make it work. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think you need both, right? Like it's not that you want to abandon sort of your thoughtful, rational, top-down plan in terms of overall strategy and vision where you want to go. And I've worked in strategy most of my career, so I certainly am empathetic to that. But at the same time, there's something to be said for being really just resourceful for the things that you have. And to your point, not in a way we're lucky in that the world we live in is not homogenous all the way across, back to our first point about traveling, seeing the cultures, et cetera, and everybody's in a different state of development. And even within a country, certainly the US and India are two great examples of this, where it's not like all of the US is the same in terms of economic development, nor India. And so you see like all these different sort of approaches and things, and people are trying stuff, and you can learn so much from that, right? And you can say, hey, like this really worked in this circumstance. You'll have an advantage, I think, from these innovative and heterogeneous ecosystems that are trying different things and trying stuff out. So I think that's a critical point, because for some countries that maybe they feel like they're not, on pure GDP terms, say like the same as the US or other countries or whatever, that doesn't mean that like they don't have a role to play and something very valuable to contribute in terms of what they might be able to come up with. And we see examples of this time and time again. It's not just India. I've been writing on Pakistan and how that's going on. There's actually a great example of the Ukraine in the ongoing war, and then sort of innovation in there in terms of how they're doing more distributed solar. These are energy examples, but there's others. 15 years ago, we started writing about like the cell phone revolution that was cell phone and banking revolution that was happening, and especially in East African countries and some West African countries. There's all these examples of like people that human beings are smart all over the world, like in every country, in every place and city and village, and they come up with like really ingenious and innovative ways to do things, right? And if you sort of respect that and look for that, and then try to find ways to harness that, there's a lot that you can learn. So yes, to your point, like I agree. Different countries will have, I don't know if it's advantages or disadvantages on the whole, but they'll certainly have all of these pockets of opportunity to do things. And if we can tap into that, then everybody's going to benefit from that.
So well said. I love Jugaad.
Same.
We
Yes.
are we are all over. Like my husband loves it because he's like, let's wherever he can save money. He's like, okay, this is a place. Let's
Yeah,
do it.
totally. Yeah.
So we have a lot of those solutions in our house, and
Uh,
he didn't grow up in India either. He's from origin India, but Indian, but he grew up in Scotland. So he has Western mindset, but then he's like faking it. Like I tell him, you're faking it. You're not true Indian, but when it comes to this, you are.
I think,
So
yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, I think there's stories of that from all different cultures, right? Like, I remember my grandmother, my father's mother, she used to I don't know if this was an actual recipe, but she used to take when you only had a little bit of meat and you wanted to feed a lot of people, she would mix it with vegetable soup that you could get in a can for like really cheap, and she called it hobo stew. Hobo is like a word for like a poor person who's homeless or whatever.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
hobo stew was like my favorite when I was a kid. It was so good. But it was
That's awesome.
when I look back on it as an adult, I was like, oh, that was because like they didn't have a lot of money. She didn't have, by that point in her life, she was doing okay. But like when they were younger, they didn't have a lot of money, and she was trying to figure out a way to like make food and budget stretch, right? There's so many examples of that, of sort of that kind of those situations, or not having like a perfect set of tools to work with, like can still drive innovation. So then I see later, like again, all the way on the other side of the world in India, where
Yes.
someone's explaining to me what jugad means, and I'm like, yep, yeah, totally, that makes sense. It resonates, right?
Yes, yes. My one of my friends says necessity is the mother of invention.
Yes,
So
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah,
that's where. Next is actually perfect transition into the energy and where we are today. The whole world is really, really, super, I think, indulged in AI, artificial intelligence. Like everybody talks about AI. Anywhere I go, any platform I go in, everything is about AI. Even Instagram is like AI. Like the feed is about AI too. Of course, maybe I consume it. That's why it's giving
it's
me that. But
inescapable, yeah.
yeah. So I think um, that and all the energy that goes in, right? Like even when I'm querying, sometimes my prompt is like, hey, can you I use Claude a lot. Like I ask Claude, hey, can you use less energy and then give me output for this query? I don't want to consume. Or if I know I'm asking the same question and I have to go back, I don't want to scroll up and figure out where the solution is. And I don't want you to do the research, but can you just summarize it for me? Try to reduce the amount of energy consumed. So with this um, lot of energy demand that's coming up with this AI usage and the grid infrastructure that is aging currently, right? It's not up to date, not as fast as we want. How do we ensure, or how do you think, being in the energy space, we need to ensure that this AI revolution doesn't really bankrupt our carbon budgets, and
Yeah,
what role do these type of creative structures we can come up with, directly going from the Jugaad thought process
yeah,
again?
yeah, no, totally.
Yeah, what
So
do you think of that?
So this is probably going to be my second somewhat contrarian take for a sustainability audience. So I had the one on like, hey, you should recognize and respect the benefit of fossil fuels. Second one is I, I have a view on waste that might be a little bit maverick, I guess. So not waste as in sort of well, it could be physical waste like landfills and items that are discarded and sort of not thoughtfully consumed, right? But just waste as a fundamental concept. So if you go back, and especially since you mentioned computation, and I can't remember the book that I read that was originally making this point, but um, they, if you go back and look at the history of computation, just computers in general, right? It wasn't that long ago. So I think probably in the late 70s and early 80s, where the only computers that existed were in large universities, right? And how that used to work is you used to have these punch cards that you would have to go to program the computer, and then you would get time on compute. And the debugging process, so anyone that's doing software development or has worked in a tech space, you think about debugging when your program doesn't work. Usually it's after you've run it and you find like, oh, something didn't work, the website crashed, whatever, you go back and try to fix it. Debugging used to be done a priori. And the reason it was is because time on compute was so valuable. Because again, like back when there was only a handful of computers, they took up an entire room. If anyone's ever watched the awesome movie called Hidden Figures, that gives you an idea of the size and scale of how big computers. And by the way, the term computer used to be for the human that set up for the machine to run the computation. Those were the computers. Now we use that term for the physical machine
Yeah.
itself. So all those
Nice.
women in there, the African American women, would have been called computers.
Computers.
But anyway, so because that was so valuable, you had to debug and you would have to reserve times. You would say, hey, like if you and I were working on a project, we needed time to like run some compute on a formula that we're working on. Let's say they'd say, okay, you get from 2:14 a.m. to 3:37 a.m. and that's your time on compute. And your cards have to be debugged by then and ready and fresh and ready to go. Great, right? Because that was the only two the compute we have. But if you think about like it was very, very hard to innovate, right? And the things that you would actually use to compute had to be like well thought out. Like your advisor, your PhD advisor, whoever had to already say, yeah, this is a good problem. It's worthy of getting the time on compute. The cards are correct and they're debugged and they're in the right order and it should compile because you couldn't waste compute time. Then you look and you say, as computational cycles got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, this is well before AI, right? Just the ability to do a floating point operation, a flop, a computation. Then there wasn't so much constraint on what you could do, right? And you could start to do things that weren't just purely mathematical formulas, which was most of what compute was used for back then. And then you think about like, say you wanted to create a digital recipe book or who knows, whatever, right? You could actually start to do that because microprocessing made compute smaller and smaller and cheaper. And essentially what you're doing, like when you try something, maybe you try to build a website or maybe you try to do something and you're like, it didn't work out, but I learned some stuff, whatever. You're wasting compute cycle. You're wasting a lot of compute, right? You make a Claude query, right? Like, yeah, Claude's a LLM I use a lot as well. And then you're like, hey, no, I guess that's not really what I wanted. Maybe I should rethink this, whatever. Well, you just wasted lots of data center time, right? You have to be able to do that to have innovation. Because if you had a perfectly optimized system across every sort of function and factor within the economy, there would be no waste, so that would be good. But by definition, you couldn't innovate because an innovation requires being able to try something. You have to have some trial and error, right? And trial and error is wasteful by definition. So if you had a truly zero waste system or society or whatever, you're saying that I already have the perfect solution that is optimal in all situations and scenarios. And it's like, one, I don't believe you. But two, like, even if that was true, right, then we're at the end of innovation. So now you look and say, okay, but AI does consume a lot of energy, right? And it's funny, what was the name of the big NVIDIA developer conference, the last one they had? They had that AI song that they were singing, and the chorus for that song was turning energy into revenue, right? So my point before about like the economy is just an expression of energy, I think NVIDIA gets that better than anyone, right? Because they're
Right.
saying fundamentally, yeah, you're taking electrons and converting that into knowledge, of some sort or another. And then everything they're doing in terms of building GPUs and data centers and AI, et cetera, and inference and training data, et cetera, is just like, what's the process for doing that? In some ways, it's driving towards efficiency because you're thinking about like, what's the best kind of output that I could get, knowing that I'm going to have these inputs. But if you think of it that way, this is why like I'm very interested in abundant energy sources. Because if you are comfortable with your energy input source, and you say, yeah, it's fine, like we have, and again, so you start to look at renewables, especially, right, or nuclear or other sources that are abundant, you can start to say, right, so if I have abundant energy sources, at least that will give me the flexibility I need in order to innovate. And probably I will figure out a more efficient way to do this or more sort of a breakthrough, just like we did with, in some ways, if you think about it, like the energy and the advances we're able to make in fossil fuels was what led us to be able to get to other energy solutions, right? We did not invent the photovoltaic cell in the 1700s. There's a reason for that, right? I don't think it would have been possible without like the fossil fuel sort of revolution that we went through. We could do wind in a way, like not a modern wind turbine, right? But like a lot of these things took going through those steps in order to find something that is a more optimal solution or a more interesting solution in terms of how you solve that. So long way of saying, like, I wouldn't feel too bad, like for your Claude queries. You may feel like, oh, but I'm not saving the world. I'm not inventing the next photovoltaic cell or whatever. True, but no one else was either. Like to all the things that led up to those advances, right? We tend to think of those as like big breakthroughs, and it's easier to go back retrospectively and look and say, ah, that was the moment, like when we did whatever, and the genius unlocked something. But that's never how it works. It's always like these thousands and thousands and millions of little advances and small things, small discoveries, small tweaks, little things that we all learn collectively along the way. And then retrospectively, we look back and say, there was this one point where a bunch of those converged and it was a big unlock. Like we made some advance, like we went to space or created a solar cell or created the first chip or microchip. But I wouldn't discount like what your contribution is to that overall human process, right? And you have to have some grace with yourself of you're probably not, your next Claude query probably won't solve cancer, right? And that's fine. Like it's okay. If you have those abundant energy sources to input so that you get like the ability to try some things, then at least you know you can live a life where that sort of innovation is possible even within your own life. So yeah, does AI consume energy and water and well, in some cases water and other things? Yeah, and there's other solutions to that. I think this is why in some ways, this is why Starlink exists. This is why Amazon LEO exists, is because now if you're in space, you get, unmitigated solar energy and, you get cooling for free because you don't have to use water. So there's all kinds of innovation that's going and trying to solve that problem, right? In terms of like, how do we keep getting compute without sort of these negative externalities? But in the meantime, like, I don't believe that you can sort of regress or degrowth your way to thriving, right? And sort of human thriving. Can you minimize the amount of mistakes you make along the way? Yeah. And can you like try not to have such a life that you are having so much thoughtless waste, where you're just sort of reckless abandon and saying, I don't care, I'll just whatever and trash everything as I go. Certainly, right? But if you're trying to live your life in a thoughtful way and you're thinking about like, I'm still having an impact. Yeah, that's going to happen. We're all going to have an impact, right? But I think you can have some grace with yourself for that.
I think I see why people say you're a positive person.
Yeah. Okay, I'll
Yeah,
wear that. Yeah.
I was just like thinking I was feeling guilty when I was querying versus like, oh, it's okay if I my query is taking a little longer than usual. So
Yeah, and also like I tend to reverse the thinking too, to maybe say what I just said more simply is
yeah.
if you think about maybe I should query less, I always try to think about what's the like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger used to say, like what's the invert of that? Like, can I think about what if I wanted to query more, right? Well, then what would have to be true? And it's like, well, for me to feel comfortable with that, I would need more energy inputs that are abundant, right, and cheap, and limited to no negative externalities, right, or minimal externalities. Then you're like, okay, great. Well, then why don't we work on building that? Because you clearly have a desire to query whatever it is that you were working on, right? Like, don't self-censor that and think, or that urge, right? And think like, yeah, I want to go build and design and live a life of thriving. They'll be like, okay, great. Then what inputs do we need for that? Versus like, okay, well, let's revert back. Let's degrowth. There's a perfectly valid sort of philosophy on the degrowth side. And if anyone wants, they can Google it and look into that. I just don't personally prescribe to it. I get their philosophy and I respect it, but it's not how I want to live. And I think like most humans probably don't want to live that way either.
No, I agree with you, and I've been there. It is not really a good space for me personally. I'm speaking
Same.
for
Yeah.
myself. It's not a good space. It kind of hinders your creativity, and it doesn't feel good. Like you're not
Yes.
alive anymore.
Yeah, you
That's how
don't feel
I
like
felt
you're
anyway.
thriving. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So I think having that independence to just have your creative mindset go, I think that's a good space, and you explained it very beautifully, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think we're moving to the end of our
Okay.
the conversation now. So this is something I ask most of my guests, and that's why we are here in the podcast Soul in the Game.
Yeah.
I want to know, why do you do what you do? You were in intelligence field, and perfectly, you seem like whatever you said, you were enjoying whatever you were doing.
Yeah.
Moving to sustainability, well, why?
Yeah. So part of, I was telling a story about how was in intelligence deployed to Baghdad. That was 2000, well, the halfway through 2009 and then into 2010. The other thing that happened then is our first child was born. So I became a father in 2009, July 3rd. And I ended up deploying, I think it was a couple months after that. I was already scheduled for the deployment. So a big part of me was thinking about, and I didn't quite have it. I don't want to make it seem like, oh, and then it hit me and I had it all figured out and I knew what I was going to do and blah, blah, blah. Definitely, that's not how it happened. It would be simpler if I probably told the story that way, but it's just not true. I just became a father, was deploying to Iraq. One of the really interesting things about that war was, if you look for every gallon or liter or whatever you want unit of fuel that was consumed in the theater in operations, whether it was jet fuel or truck fuel, it was mostly all JP8. It took about 20 gallons of finished fuel to deliver it, to get it to the point where it needs to be used on average, right? Some took more, some took less. If you look at the fuel convoys that ran through that by US and Allied forces through that country, for every 39 fuel convoys, there was one casualty. It was one of the biggest sort of vulnerabilities of the armed forces there, in terms of, because the logistics and supply chain around fuel was so intense. And then you think about, like, there was sort of the topic of energy, and oil particularly was on every angle of that conflict, right? Like, in terms of what was happening there in global markets, and then the fuel that was actually consumed tactically in there, right? So I was thinking a lot about that. It also happened that Baghdad, similar to, it has about the same climate as Arizona. So you know what Arizona is like in August. It's just like that in Baghdad. It's
Right. Yes.
crazy hot. Like in Fahrenheit, it's well over 100 every day. In Celsius, it's, in the 40s. Very, very, very hot. So, I landed in something that was really hot, really shocking. First time in theater, thinking about energy, thinking about climate, thinking about how those two were related, thinking about sort of fatherhood and or parenthood, I should say, and sort of legacy and what that meant for my child, and then eventually children. We ended up having another child about 2 years later. That, and then thinking about, like, my ties to sort of the environment and nature and the Born on Earth Day thing. It was, oh, yeah, that's right. Like, sort of remember, like, yeah, yeah, like, right. It starts to come together. I still didn't have it all figured out. Like, I kind of knew, it was like, okay, I know, like, I want to sort of transition my career in this direction, but it wasn't like a hard pivot. And then I just started doing some. I did an MBA first at Thunderbird School of Global Management, and then eventually went and did a PhD at ASU. Worked kind of on in different, some still in intelligence and defense, and then some in energy, and then was back and forth. Now I've been in energy for a good, the rest of the chunk of my career. But yeah, it came back to that driving thing around, like, look, I don't know what kind of difference I'm gonna make, but I know I'm gonna try to have some kind of impact. And there's a great, it's not a quote, but like an idea, I guess, by a guy named Buckminster Fuller, who was like one of these sort of visionary thinkers from the 60s and 70s. If anyone's interested, he invented the geodesic dome and a couple other cool concepts all around, like, design approaches to things. He was in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, a long time ago. I think he was born around the turn of the century. And he used to talk a lot about something called the trim tab. This is an actual thing. So if you look at, like, a carrier ship as an example, it's the size of a small city. It supports about 5,000 people. It's about, I think, what is it, like 2.5 football fields, American football fields, laid end to end. That's how big the deck of that thing is. The rudder, the thing that steers the ship, is about 2 stories tall. So it's about as tall as a 2-story building. It's big, like, massive. I forget, it's 10,000 some pounds, I believe. So if you want to change that ship, just moving that rudder is really hard, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
massive.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
On the rudder is a smaller rudder, basically. It's called the
Okay.
trim tab. And that trim tab moves a little bit and that creates the current flow in the water, right? So just its only job is to move the rudder a little bit, a couple degrees, right? So the trim tab turns, that starts to turn the rudder, and then the rudder can slowly turn the ship, right? And I'm like, it's hard to be a rudder because no human is that big. I don't mean physically big, but like outsized impact, right? But you can be a trim tab in the work that you're doing, whether that's in sustainability, energy, whatever, right? Like maybe it's in health, maybe it's in child education, whatever it is you're doing. Um, and so my similar to Buckminster Fuller, he had sort of an existential crisis actually when he tells a really interesting story about this in one of his books, and he was thinking about like what kind of impact can I have, because it's really hard to be the rudder, but again, you can be the trim tab. So for me personally, I had that same sort of combination of thinking about like this is the impact I can have, and the other part of the metaphor, right, is like most people probably will never see that work. So you have to be comfortable with that idea, right? You're way below water. You're way below the surface. People aren't seeing what you're doing down there.
Fame part of it.
Yeah, right. And it's there might be very little or no fame whatsoever.
Fame.
And that's fine.
Or negative fame also.
Yeah. And you're just there like doing your work, right?
Doing your
And
work.
you know what kind of impact you're having. Everybody else might not pull that together, right? Or bring that together. But yeah, and that's the life I decided to live. So
Yeah. Thank you. That is very, because the moment from becoming a father and then you being somewhere else at that time, in fighting for energy almost, which we can relate today with what's
big
going
time.
on.
Yes, 100%.
So kind of that's very relatable. I think everybody right now can relate to that part of the, you know, feeling that you just expressed, and thank you for all your work you're doing in the field of energy and
Well,
being a trim tab.
same to you. Thank you for all the work you're doing. Yeah, 100%. That's how we get there.
Yeah, we'll get the rudder moving. So and I think it was a great conversation. I really didn't know what to expect because I haven't spoken to you probably in past, I don't know, 8 years or so.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So,
Yes.
I mean, I see your posts on LinkedIn a lot, and if for the audience, if anybody wants to see Wes's work, go to LinkedIn, and I'm going to put that in the description as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, if you're listening, feel free to reach out. I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. We also didn't mention it, but we have a newsletter out now called Sustainability Decoded. So and we post that stuff on LinkedIn as well. Me and a couple other people that have been writing for that. And to your point, like, yeah, we're trying to do, and I have a day job, obviously, so I stay busy. But we're trying yeah, like support other people that are out there doing what we're doing.
yes. So, thanks a lot, Wes, and happy birthday and happier
Thank
day
you.
again in
Yes.
advance. Take
Thank you.
care, and we'll probably talk again in later on as the work goes
Yeah,
on.
we'll do the part two. There you go.
Yes. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.